In 1946, America was technically at peace, but millions of families were quietly drowning in the economic fallout of post-war hangover. The Lake family was one of them. Leonard's earliest memories weren't of a comfortable childhood home, but of the cold, cramped walls of public housing where his parents constantly struggled just to keep food on the table. But the financial strain was nothing compared to the emotional rot that set in. By the time Leonard was old enough to start kindergarten, his world completely fractured. First, his father walked out, abandoning the family. Just months later, his mother did the exact same thing, leaving 5-year-old Leonard completely discarded. He was taken in by his grandmother. On paper, this should have been the turning point where his life stabilized. The hunger stopped, the biting poverty eased. He had clothes, regular meals, and even spent his summers outdoors at nature camps. But this new comfort came with a steep price. His grandmother was a strict, unyielding disciplinarian who ruled with an iron fist. And inside that house, resentment was quietly brewing. Leonard deeply despised his brother, Donald, who suffered from a mental impairment and required constant attention. Surrounded by strict rules and a brother he hated, Leonard began retreating into a dark, secret world of his own. By the time he hit his youth, the secret world took a deeply disturbing turn. Armed with a camera, Leonard began taking nude photographs of women in his life, secretly violating the privacy of his own sisters and cousins. The boy who had been abandoned by his parents was growing up. The material poverty was gone, but it was being replaced by a much more dangerous kind of poverty, a total lack of empathy, and a predatory obsession with control that would eventually shock the entire nation. By the mid-1960s rolled around, Leonard Lake was looking for a way out of his grandmother's strict household. In January 1964, he found it by putting on a uniform and joining the United States Marines. For the next 7 years, the military would define his life. It was during this time, in this spring of 1969, that he married his first wife, a woman named Karen Lee Maynardman. But the real shadow hanging over this era was the Vietnam War. Lake was shipped out to Southeast Asia, serving as a radar technician. Later in life, Lake would loudly brag to anyone who would listen about the people he killed in the jungles of Vietnam. But it was a lie. The truth was that he was a technician, he never once saw actual combat, yet even without the trauma of the front lines, something inside of Leonard was fracturing. His second tour of duty ended abruptly when he was shipped back to California and placed into a military psychiatric ward for 2 long months. By 1971, he was out of the Marines. By 1972, his wife had divorced him. The fragile veneer of his normal life was completely gone. Seeking a fresh start, Lake drifted into the foggy, rugged hills of North Ukiah, California in 1974, where he moved into a ranch, a remote counterculture commune, where rules were loose and society's expectations didn't apply. He moved with a woman named Venus Salem, embedding himself in the hippie lifestyle. It was at that ranch that Lake became obsessed with a bizarre, almost mythological spectacle. He crossed paths with Sir Lancelot, a goat that had been surgically altered so its horns grew together into a single central spike. Lake essentially became a traveling showman for this biological anomaly, using the unicorn as a bizarre conversation starter to attract people, particularly women. Charles Ng was born in British Hong Kong. On the outside, Charles looked incredibly lucky. He was the only son of a very wealthy business executive, but behind closed doors of that rich household, his childhood was a total nightmare. His father was incredibly harsh, subjecting the young boy into a severe physical and emotional abuse. Unsurprisingly, all that trauma took a toll. By the time Charles hits his teenage years, he was a deeply troubled loner who couldn't stay out of trouble. He was kicked out of school after school. Then at just 15 years old, he got busted for shoplifting. Fed up, his father shipped him across the ocean to a strict boarding school in Yorkshire, England, hoping the British discipline would straighten him out. It didn't work. Before long, Charles was caught stealing from his classmates and got expelled again, forcing him right back to Hong Kong. By 1978, Charles was looking for a fresh start. he managed to get a student visa and moved to California, enrolling as a biology student at the College of Notre Dame. But just like everything else in his life, it didn't last. He dropped out only after one semester. Now he was a dropout wandering around California with no real direction. And then he made a massive mistake. He got into a bad hit-and-run car accident. Desperate to avoid going to jail and facing prosecution, Charles needed a place to hide in plain sight. So he made a frantic move. He walked into a recruitment office and enlisted into the United States Marine Corps, using a false birth certificate just to get in. It was a desperate move by a young man running from the law, but it was this exact decision that would eventually put him in a collision course with Leonard Lake. So now that we've already introduced the two characters of this video, let's continue on and understanding what these two did together once they've went off into Ukiah, California. By 1982, the paths of Leonard Lakes and Charles Ng finally crossed, and they immediately bonded over a shared obsession with weapons, survivalism, and a deeply dark worldview. They moved into a mobile home together in Ukiah, California, but it didn't take long for their underground activities to catch the attention of the law. That same year, federal agents swarmed their trailer. When the feds busted inside, they found a massive, terrifying stash of illegal military weapons and explosives. Both men were cuffed and hauled away, but their paths split immediately after the arrest. Lake managed to post bond and get out of jail, but the second his feet hit the pavement, he ran. He jumped bail, completely vanished from the radar, and fled into the deep, isolated foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. He hid out in the remote cabin in a tiny community called Wilseyville, a property owned by his ex-wife, Carolyn. Up there, surrounded by dense trees and miles of nothingness, Lake began building a hidden bunker, preparing for what he believed was an impending apocalypse. Charles Ng wasn't so lucky. He was captured by authorities and handed back over to the Marines. Facing massive federal charges, Ng cut a plea deal, pleading guilty to military theft and desertion. The judge handed him a sentence at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Sorry, I can't pronounce this for some reason. One of the military's most notorious stockades. Ng spent 18 months behind bars. By 1984, he was paroled and slapped with a dishonorable charge. He was a free man again, but he had nowhere to go. No money and a mind that had only grown darker during his time in prison. Naturally, the very first thing he did was head straight for the mountains of Wilseyville, looking for his old friend Leonard Lake. The two partners were back together, and this time, out in the middle of nowhere, there was no one around to watch what they were going to do next. Alright, this is the portion of the video where I'm going to be talking about what these two have done together, both Charles and Leonard. So this is the point of the video where you should stop. If you are faint of heart, please leave this video. If you can't, endure any of the explanations that are pretty graphic and disturbing, it's best to just leave. But however, if you do want to be informed of what these two did during their time out in the Wilseyville mountains, I mispronounced that location, but if you really want to know what happened out there, then please, your discretion is advised. That's all I'm going to say. Anyways, let's continue with the video. Alright, without further ado, let's continue. By 1984, the remote cabin in Wilseyville, California had transformed into a living nightmare. Leonard Lake had become completely obsessed with a 1963 psychological horror novel called The Collector, which tells the story of a man who kidnaps a woman to keep as his slave. Lake adopted this as his blueprint, naming his horrific fantasy Operation Miranda. Together with Charles Ng, Lake built a concrete cinder block bunker right next to his cabin. On the outside, Lake claimed it his fallout shelter for a nuclear war. On the inside, it was a high-tech dungeon used for his future victims. The two men began a terrifying rampage across Northern California, targeting families, young couples, and infants. Their pattern was a cold, calculated, and they would kill the men and the babies almost immediately, keeping the women alive. inside the bunker to subject them to days of psychological torment, rape, and torture before finally taking their lives. They didn't just steal lives, they stole identities and money. Lake even lured his own brother, Donald, and his former best man, Charles Gunner, to the cabin, shooting them in their sleep so he could steal their disability checks and bank accounts. To find other victims, they simply scanned local newspaper classified ads, targeting regular people who were just trying to sell their cars. So, to put this in perspective, they would ended up with getting the car, but not giving the people their money. Instead, they introduced them into captivity and very disgusting torture methods that they've kept in those bunkers for a very long time. Like, I don't know what other serial killer might be capable of doing this, but unfortunately, this would be the most craziest radical story of victims being lured into a serial killer's property and then being turned into their captive victims. And let me explain this to you guys. This was what happened to the sellers when they ended up in their bunker. They never left alive. Spoiler alert, these guys got away with almost everything they've done to anyone who ever came into those bunkers. But their dark secret world came crashing down on June 2nd, 1985. Not because of a massive FBI investigation, but because of Charles Ng's unstoppable urge to shoplift. The duo pulled up to a lumber store in South San Francisco in a Honda Prelude. Inside, an employee caught Ng trying to steal a cheap $75 vise. When confronted, Ng panicked, tossed his vise into the trunk of the car, and sprinted away into the neighborhood. Minutes later, the police arrived. When they opened the trunk to look for the stolen vise, they found something much worse, a .22 caliber pistol equipped with a silencer. Lake tried to smooth things over, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the officers weren't buying it. They arrested him on the spot. At the station, the police realized something was seriously wrong. The driver's license Lake handed to them belonged to a missing man named Robin Scott Stapley. The car itself belonged to another missing man, Paul Cosner. Realizing the walls were closing in, Lake dropped his fake alias and confessed his real name, along with Charles Ng's identity. Then he asked the detectives for a pencil, a piece of paper, and a glass of water. When left alone in the interrogation room, Lake wrote a brief note to his ex-wife, pulled a cyanide capsule hidden in the lining of his jacket, and swallowed it. He died 4 days later, taking his secrets to the grave. But the police now had a trail to follow, a utility bill under the passenger seat that led them straight into the Wilseyville cabin. On June 4th, detectives stepped onto the property. What they found was very shocking and disturbing. That shocked the entire country. Inside the concrete bunker, they found handcuffs, tools, lists of typewritten rules for female victims, and a hidden door leading to a tiny windowless cell containing a single mattress and a bucket. They also dug up 2 buried 5-gallon buckets. One acted as a treasure map of victims filled with IDs and wallets. The other contained Lake's personal diaries and 2 horrifying videotapes. The tapes showed Lake and Ng actively terrorizing their victims. In one haunting video, Charles Ng is using a knife to cut the shirt off of a young mother named Brenda O'Connor, coldly telling her, "You can try and cry and stuff, like the rest of them, but it won't do any good. We are pretty cold-hearted." Just outside of the bunker, the true scale of the horror was revealed. In a makeshift burial site, forensic teams unearthed 45 pounds of burned and crushed human bone fragments. Investigators estimated that Leonard Lake and Charles Ng had slaughtered up to 25 people, including 2 or 3 children. So yeah, in one of the videos, you could actively see Ng trying to cut off Brenda's top and everything, and it's just unrealistic. I mean, he also admitted to killing her husband and child just so he could have his sick fantasy, so they wouldn't get in the way of it. He sees them as nothing. He sees them as non-human, as just flesh or animals. It's very disgusting. So in a way, these two were responsible for destroying families as well. While investigators were uncovering the slaughterhouse, Charles Ng was already on the run. Lake's ex-wife had driven him to the airport, where he used a fake name to catch a flight to Chicago, eventually slipping across the border into Canada. But Ng couldn't stop stealing. A month later, in Calgary, Alberta, he was busted shoplifting a single can of salmon from a department store. When a security guard tried to stop him, Ng pulled a gun and shot at the guard's hand. He was tackled, arrested, and thrown into Canadian prison. The devastating cross-border rampage of California's most twisted duo was finally over, undone by a stolen vise and a can of fish. For this portion of the video, I'll be focusing on the victims and what they've had to experience while being in the presence of Charles and Leonard's property, and from there we will conclude the story. But for now, we will be talking about the victims and what they've unfortunately had to experience. I cannot imagine what they had to go through being with these monsters, how they didn't look at life as something as precious. That's absolutely sickening. Maurice Anthony Rock and Reginald Reggie Frisbee. Summer 1984, both disappeared from the same building. Lake used a fake name to scope them out, even trying to lure a neighbor into his room under this guise of taking photos. Maurice and Reggie were executed and buried in a shared grave. Frisbee's skeleton remained a nameless mystery until advanced genetic genealogy finally identified him in January 2025. It took them so long. It took them 40 years just to figure out who he was when he unfortunately met his demise under these two disgusting animals. Randy Vern Jacobson, 1984, vanished after getting involved in a business deal with Lake. Lake murdered him, buried him on the property, and unsuccessfully tried to steal his van. Cheryl Lynn Okoro, November 1984, disappeared from the exact same rooming house. While her remains were never been found, her photos and 11-page personal letter were discovered hidden at the Wilseyville bunker. Now, was kept alive in the bunker for videotaped torture, and the baby vanished forever. When Lake was arrested weeks later, he was using Robin Stapley's driver's license and driving with Lonnie Bond's plates. So to simple this down, to just simplify it, they basically killed a family, a friend of their family, and they've gotten rid of a baby like it was nothing. The infant was never found, and it's unfortunate what that happened to their infant, and that they had to be part of their disgusting demise, that their disgusting fantasies were lived, and they unfortunately had to suffer under it. So after all of this, what are we left with? Well, we're left with one person who unfortunately is still alive to this day, and is the only man who lived through this disgusting, deplorable experience. And it was to his benefit. Charles Ng was clearly a monster. He had no lack of empathy for any of his victims. And so now we're left with him. And this is what happened. While investigators in California were dealing with the horrors left behind in the dirt of Wilseyville, Charles Ng was sitting in a cold Canadian prison cell. He was serving 4.5 years for shooting that department store security guard over a stolen can of salmon. But the real battle began when the California authorities demanded his extradition. Ng hired a team of lawyers and fought tooth and nail to stay in Canada, arguing that sending him back to California, where he faced the death penalty, violated his human rights. As if he had the room to talk about fucking human rights. I'm sorry for the language, but Jesus Christ, the nerve of this man. The legal games was dragged on for years, but by 1991, the Canadian Supreme Court completely ran out of patience. They threw out his final appeal, and in a move that felt straight out of an action movie, Canadian police marched Ng to the border and handed him over to the California investigators just 18 minutes after the court's ruling. Back on American soil, Ng was hit with 12 counts of first-degree murder. Yeah, and he still had the nerve to talk about his freaking human rights. Again, I apologize for the language. Even though the police had diaries detailing his involvement and horrific videotapes showing him actively cutting the clothes off of victims, Ng put on a completely straight face and played the victim. He claimed he was just a helpless observer. He told the court that Leonard Lake was the mastermind who planned and committed every single kidnapping and murder completely unassisted. It took years to get the case to trial, but by February 1999, a California jury saw right through the lies. Ng was convicted of 11 of the 12 murders, the brutal executions of 6 men, 3 women, and 2 tiny helpless infants. The jury only deadlocked on a single charge, the murder of Paul Cosner, the man who owned the Honda Prelude, but it didn't save him. Charles Ng was officially sentenced to death. Even the judge took a moment to call out Ng's pathetic defense, stating on the record that Ng was never under any duress, and there was absolutely zero evidence that he was being dominated by Leonard Lake. He was full, willing partner in the slaughter. Today, Charles Ng is still alive. He is currently locked away in this California medical facility, an aging inmate who has successfully cheated the executioner for decades. California hasn't actually put an inmate to death since 2006, and in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order pausing the death penalty in the state entirely. The state of California might never strap Charles Ng to a gurney or pull the switch, but as he sits in that cell, aging behind bars, he is forced to live with the reality that a cheap hardware store vise and a 75-cent can of salmon is the reason why he is now rotting away in a prison cell and will not be put on parole. He is now in a cell for the rest of his life. The fact that shoplifting was the only sin that brought him back into the place that he actually belongs, which is prison. Unfortunately, the innocent people that had to be around his presence had to suffer in a makeshift prison. But, however, let's just say this. Karma is absolutely a female dog. And Ing, let's hope he suffers that same fate, being able to not see anybody, nothing but concrete walls for the rest of his life. Yeah, and that just about does it. This story was just something I wanted to share with you guys because I love talking about stories about past serial killers or whatnot, or something that happened in the United States that's shocked the country for years and years to come. And this was definitely one of them. Unfortunately, these two bastards was caught in my birthday in June 2nd. And hopefully, let's hope that they never, ever get to enjoy what real peace is. They should have left these people alone. They were just innocent people trying to live their lives. And unfortunately, these two had fantasies that they were trying to live in reality. But unfortunately, their fantasies came with consequences. And hopefully, they get to suffer whatever comes to their lives. Unfortunately, Leonard Lake passed on because he's a coward. And Charles Ing is living what Leonard Lake should have had suffered with to begin with. But I would have seen him at least taking his own life at a prison cell as well. But besides that, Charles Ing is now currently serving his sentence. And let's just hope we never see him at a light of day ever again, in public even, not even in our society. He is still considered a dangerous person to this day. And with that being said, I hope to see you guys later. All right, I'll see you guys later. See you. Bye.